Well, good evening, everyone, and thank you for coming to the next edition of our guest speaker series. This is a series of events that we put on every year. We have one or two every month, something we started 6 years ago now. So we've had a lot of interesting speakers come through our doors. And this year we're happy that it is funded in part through a grant through the Council for the Arts, administered by GoArt, so we're very thankful to them for helping us make this happen. So tonight we have Mr. Rick Falkowski joining us, and he is author, speaker, teacher. He's got many different titles. I'll let him choose which one he wants to do tonight. But he's written several books. You can see them all up in front here. But one that he'll be focusing on is the historic and influential people of Buffalo and West New York, the early 1800s. He has the 1900s, and he's told me he's working on volume 3, which would be up to the present day. So
that'll be the late 1900s.
Late 1900s, so almost up to the present.
I don't want to write about present day people because they can come and find me.
Yeah. That's up to them. But so we thought it was perfect to do the early 1800s because a lot of the people he's going to discuss have some impact right here in our backyard. So thank you, Rick, for coming out, and the floor is yours.
Oh, thank you. Hi, everybody.
Hi.
I'm Rick Falkowski now. Pleasure to meet you. Now, like you said, writer, author. I was explaining to the cameraman, I worked for the cable company for many years. I handled all the business services for cable. If you have anything against the cable company, I never sold anything to a person in my life. I just sold things to businesses, so I will not take your complaint. Okay, but anyways, I retired from there and I wrote a book about music because I've been involved in music for, back to the old days out this way. Remember the Engine House?
Oh, yeah.
Okay, I used to own Backstage magazine back in the 80s. I was really good friends with Calvin and Guy Nichols from the Trolls. They always came up my way and played at Stage 1 and everything like that. I'm the founder of the Buffalo Music Hall of Fame. I ran the Buffalo Music Awards for a number of years. And when I retired, I started to write a book about music, so I did. I started doing talks and I said, well, this is a lot of fun. So I said, what else can I write about? So I said, I wanted to be a history teacher, so I'll write about history. My first book was the early 1800s, which is going to be the crux of today's conversation. And today is going to be, you're going to be guinea pigs, by the way. I don't know if you knew that when you left your house, you were going to be a guinea pig today. But I've been giving this talk for like 4 years. And I decided it was time for a little bit of a refresh. The town of Amherst hired me to give a class at the senior center called History of Western New York. It was a 6-week, 90-minute class. So what I did is I incorporated some of the things from that class into this talk. So this is going to be interesting for me as well as it will be for you, because I won't know where I'm going to be going. No, that's not true. Well, anyways, today we're going to be talking about people associated with starting the city of Buffalo, creating a harbor for Buffalo, the War of 1812, building Erie Canal, and of course, Joseph Ellicott, because we're in his building right now, okay? But before we start going into all the history, I just wanted to say something quickly about the geology and everything like that of the area. Do you know that the glaciers from the Ice Age only started retreating 35,000 years ago? And about 20,000 years ago, Niagara Falls and the Great Lakes were formed. And it was only 3,000 years ago that the Great Lakes took their present shapes and sizes. There was something called Lake Tonawanda, okay? And it existed about 10,000 years ago. When the glaciers started to melt, the water levels are much higher than they are today. So Lake Tonawanda, if you look over here, in Lockport, it actually spilled into the area of Lake Iroquois. And then water levels went down some more, Lake Iroquois receded, and we ended up getting the present Lake Ontario, which you can see there. And the first Europeans to really come to the Western New York area were, they come later. Okay, prior to any of the Europeans coming here, the Seneca were the Western Indian tribe of the Six Nations. That's the Seneca, the Cayuga, Onondaga, Oneida, Mohawk, and later the Tuscarora. The Iroquois, or the Six Nations, called themselves the Haudenosaunee. Okay, and what does that mean? It means the people of the Longhouse. The map over here shows the locations of the 6 nations across the state. In the western New York area, even about where we are right now, is the area of the WNY. And the Erie were in southern New York, and there was also a tribe called the Neutral, which were right across the Niagara River in Canada. But they also had some villages, you know, in like the Lewiston area. And the Seneca were actually east of the Genesee River in the Rochester area or the Finger Lakes. So they were like the distance I came today on my stagecoach. I'd have to go that distance once more to get to where the Seneca actually started. There was something called the Beaver Wars. During the Beaver Wars, the Indians or Native Americans fought for control of the fur trade. Who was going to have the rights to sell to the French and the English? And the Seneca defeated the 3 tribes we mentioned in the mid-1600s. And these tribes didn't disappear. They were assimilated into the Seneca. Okay, so the Neutral and the WNY and the Erie became part of the Seneca. The Seneca moved into the western New York area. The first village they built was called Little Rapid. And that was probably where Black Rock is today, like in the Buffalo area. And then they also settled along the Buffalo Creek. That's how we got the Buffalo Creek Casino, because they ended up settling within that area. Like I said, the French were the first European power to come to western New York. Champlain explored Lake Ontario, and some French missionaries did visit Seneca in western New York. La Salle visited the mouth of the Niagara River in 1678, and he came back with Father Hennepin. Father Hennepin was the first European to write about Niagara Falls. When Hennepin saw the falls, twice as much water went over it than does today. Why? Half the water is now siphoned off for hydroelectric power. So as beautiful as Niagara Falls is today, it was more beautiful when La Salle and Hennepin first looked at it. And this was 350 years ago. That sounds like a long time ago, doesn't it? But it's not. Think about Europe, European history. My ex-daughter-in-law just bought a house in England, which is over 600 years old. We don't have that stuff here, but it was only 350 years ago that, you know, La Salle ended up coming here. La Salle started building a ship. That ship was called Le Griffin, and he was building it on Cayuga Island, which is just above Niagara Falls. For some reason, you can't go up the falls with a boat. You have to build a boat above the falls, okay? Well, they ended up launching that ship in May because it was rumored that Seneca were planning on burning the ship. Well, so this is May. Due to the current of the Niagara River, it took them until August 7th to get that ship out of the Niagara River because of the current, okay? And it was the first sailing ship in the Western Great Lakes. It was totally filled with furs that it got on the western end of the Great Lakes, and it got lost on its first voyage. It was never to be found again, but still, it was the first ship. And Le Griffin, if that sounds familiar, if you're any basketball fans, Canisius College, they are the Griffins, okay? Jean Kier was really 3 separate people. That's why you hear so much about John Kier. He was three places at one time. The father, Thomas, arrived in North America all the way back in 1687. And he was captured immediately in the Montreal area by some members of the Haudenosaunee tribe. Well, there happened to be a Seneca chief there, and they tortured his friend. They were just about to torture John Kier when he reeled back and punched the Seneca chief in the face and broke his nose. Did you think that infuriated the Seneca? No. They said, this is a brave man. We are going to adopt him. So the Seneca actually made John Kier a member of the Seneca tribe. And he ended up learning a bunch of different dialects of the different Haudenosaunee. And he ended up founding the first trading post in Lewiston, New York in 1719 on the grounds of Art Park. And you ever go to Art Park where you have the concerts and everything like that? Well, where that trading post was, is you got the first parking area before you get to the permanent arena for Art Park. It was right in that area there. That's where John Kier had his place. Plus he had another post right all the way down at the shore. And if you notice over there, there's all these cliffs. Well, that area became known as the carrying place. Because if you wanted to transport anything to the other side of Niagara Falls, you had to carry it up that steep cliff at Lewiston. Well, in 1750, his son Daniel replaced his father as the portage master. And what he did is above the falls, he built Little Fort Niagara. And if you're going to Niagara Falls, you go over the Grand Island Bridge. The second one, you see a chimney. The bottom left-hand photo, that's on the left-hand side before the river. That actually is part of Daniel's building all the way back in 1750. So that's the second oldest piece of architecture in the Western New York area. The oldest, of course, is the French Castle, okay, at Fort Niagara. And in 1758, he actually built a settlement at Buffalo Creek. And there's a historic marker about it on the far right. And it was actually a big settlement, several buildings, a whole bunch of cultivated fields. It was located on the site of where the General Mills plant is today, near the Buffalo Harbor. If you ever come to Buffalo and you go to an event at Riverworks, you're going to pass where that fort was when you end up going there. John Keir also was the first person to harness the power of the Niagara River. Oh, do you know the Niagara River's not a river? What is it? It's straight. A river goes from a high ground down to a lake. A strait connects two bodies of water. Niagara River connects two bodies of water. So it's Niagara Strait. You know anybody that calls it Niagara Strait? I didn't either, so it's always going to be called the Niagara River. Okay. Well, what he did is he was the first to harness the power. He ended up building an area where he cut off part of an island, which became known as Willow Island. And he got water power from the Niagara River. That was done all the way back in 1759. In fact, Willow Island existed all the way until 1960, when the Robert Moses Parkway was built. Well, the British, they didn't have any settlements in Western New York until the French and Indian War. During the French and Indian War, the British ended up winning, okay? And they took control of Fort Niagara in 1763. And to protect Western New York, what they ended up doing is building Fort Erie on the western side of the Niagara Strait. Sounds like a river. And on the western side is the Niagara River. And what they did is, if you ever read about what happens there, every winter all the ice comes up and destroys everything over like around where Crystal Beach is and where Erie Beach used to be. That's where they built the fort. So what they ended up doing is having to move the fort up on top where Fort Erie is today. You know, so it didn't continually getting destroyed. Well, the English also continued the portage that the French established around Niagara Falls. They leased that business to a guy by the name of John Stedman. And Stedman took possession of all John Keir's former land and storehouses and his portage facilities in Little Fort Niagara and Lewiston. And he rebuilt that area and built something called Fort Slocia, which you can see there on the left. It's a blurry picture. I took that many, many years ago with a bad camera in like the late 1700s, so I couldn't get a good photo. And he improved the portage going around the falls. And what he did is he ended up using more wagons and horses to move the goods from Lewiston over to Fort Slocia. So he employed fewer Seneca than were employed before when the French were there. Well, Seneca didn't like this, okay? The British policy ended up being really bad towards the Seneca every place, and people like Stedman were taking advantage of the Native Americans wherever they went. So there was something called Pontiac's Rebellion. The chief from the Seneca in Western New York that ended up being the leader on that was Farmer's brother. And what he did is he attacked Stedman's wagon train at Devil's Hole. If you ever go to Niagara Falls, there's a park just after that called Devil's Hole. And he ended up killing 21 Teamsters, soldiers in Fort Gray, which was closer than Fort Niagara, heard all the commotion. 81 soldiers came and they got killed. So over 100 Englishmen were killed by the Seneca warriors led by Farmer's brother. He was a great leader. You want to know why? Only one Seneca was wounded in that entire encounter. Talk about really knowing how to take care of your men. But in retribution for the Devil's Hole massacre, the Seneca had to give to the English what became known as the New York Reservation along Niagara River all the way from Lewiston to Black Rock. And there was 1 mile of land that was ceded really to the state. Well, Buffalo Creek, okay, was right across the mouth of the Niagara River. In fact, you can see right here, there's Fort Erie on the other side. How small was Buffalo Creek? Here's the first people that were there. We can record who were the first people that lived in Buffalo. Okay, Cornelius Winnie is really credited as being the first white settler of what became Buffalo. He arrived in like 1783 or 1784. Black Joe Hodge was actually the first non-Native American resident of Western New York. He was an escaped slave that was captured by the Seneca, and he lived on Seneca land in Silver Creek. So the first non-Native American to live in Western New York was a Black American. And he was also one of the first business owners. Okay, William Johnson. William Johnson was the first property owner in Buffalo. Some land was gifted to him by the Seneca. But what happened is he arrived in Western New York as an English soldier. That's a picture of the boat they landed on all the way back in 1780 at Fort Niagara. What he did is he lived in Buffalo Creek with the Seneca as in the British Indian Department, serving as an interpreter. Well, when the British vacated Fort Niagara at the end of the American Revolution, Revolution ended in like 1781, but they didn't leave until 1794. I guess they liked the place. Okay, he decided to stay in Western New York. He married a Seneca woman, and he built a home at the corner of Exchange and Washington Streets. The Seneca gave him land that included the mouth of the Buffalo River. Joseph Ellicott, there's Joseph right there, along with Johnson. What Ellicott wanted, that part of that land where the mouth of the Buffalo River ended up going in, because he said, how could I have a village unless it had water access? Okay. Another early person was Middlebauer. Here's a photo of his home. And Middlebauer and his son-in-law, Ezekiel Lane, they may have been the first white settlers in Western New York, but they lived in Lewiston before coming to Buffalo. So you actually have 3 different people that claim they're the first settler here. And each one of them are in a different way, shape, form, or manner. And there were some other early settlers in this area, okay? What's interesting is if you look at this, 2 of these people own taverns. Does that say something about the people from Buffalo?
Not tavern.
Okay, well, here's a map in 1804. This shows all the land holdings of Western New York all the way to the Finger Lakes. And the states of New York and Massachusetts both claimed Western New York as being their land. Well, there was a treaty in Hartford in 1786, and Massachusetts was awarded the rights to the Western New York area, not New York State. A guy named Oliver Phelps and Nathaniel Gorham purchased all the land from Massachusetts, but they didn't extinguish the Indian title to the land. So in 1790, Robert Morris ended up purchasing the land. Robert Morris was one of the signers of the Declaration of Independence, and he was the financer of the American Revolution. He was considered the richest man in America, sort of like a Bill Gates or an Elon Musk or something like that, but all the way back in them days. Well, he negotiated the purchase of the land. He was financially extended. He ended up retaining the narrow section for himself, and he sold the rest to the Holland Land Company. And that was all brokered by Theophile Cazenove, or as we call him in Buffalo, Cazenovia. Okay? And here's how all the land was set up. In 1797, Morris convened what was called the Treaty of Big Tree at Geneseo. And it was attended by a commissioner of the United States, and the Seneca were represented by who? A whole bunch of chiefs. But who was the main negotiator? Mary Jemison. Mary Jemison, the white woman of the Genesee, was really the leader for all the Native Americans in that meeting. And of course, Red Jacket, Corn Planter, and a whole bunch of other chiefs were also there. And this is what established the reservations, which you can see on the map here, for the Native Americans. Well, Red Jacket was the chief of one of the great orders of the Seneca Nation. In the year 1800, he was probably the best known person living in the village of Buffalo. How did he get his name? Red Jacket. You can see his name. It's like, I tried to learn Spanish when I went to high school. Forget it. I've been in the Caribbean a whole bunch of times. The only thing I ever learned was donde está el baño. Where's the bathroom? Okay. And Red Jacket ended up getting his name because he was a messenger for the British during the American Revolution. So they could identify him. They gave him a red jacket. So he ended up calling himself Red Jacket. And he also was given a peace medal in 1792 by George Washington. You can see in the top right photo over there, that's Red Jacket with the peace medal. Well, what Red Jacket did is he argued for retaining the Indian traditions. He wasn't in favor of Christianity. He said, we have our Native American religion, that's what we should have. In fact, he was successful in getting the missionaries removed from the Buffalo Creek Reservation. And eventually his wife converted to Christianity. What do you think he did when his wife converted to Christianity? Well, he was the chief, okay? He kicked her out of the house. Okay, then his son converted to Christianity, and he got married in a Christian ceremony. What did Red Jacket do? He converted. That's proof you better listen to your wife. In 1801, Red Jacket was accused of witchcraft by Handsome Lake and Corn Planter. The trial is shown on this famous painting you can see there on the left. And what he did is he successfully defended himself and retained his position as the leader of the Seneca. He was originally buried in South Buffalo area at the Seneca Mission Cemetery. Little picture of it there in the top right. And then he was moved to Forest Lawn. When you go to Forest Lawn Cemetery, the first thing that you see is the statue of the Red Jacket. If you've never gone to Forest Lawn Cemetery to look at all the gravestones and the fantastic monuments, you are missing a trip of a lifetime. I really recommend going there. In fact, my wife and I go there on a regular basis. In fact, my wife and I have been married for 52 years. We've been going there for so long. Back in the 60s, we'd go there with like a quart of Genesee and a Mike Sub. We've been going to that place for a long time. Okay. Well, anyways, Joseph Ellicott was the surveyor for the Holland Land Company. He negotiated with Johnson, as we said before, to change the southern boundary of the land. Now, what do we mean by changing the southern boundary? Okay, the southern boundary of the Holland Land Company was William Street, which ended up going all the way out to here. So their land ended up here. Where's the mouth of the Buffalo River or the Buffalo Creek? All the way down here. So what he negotiated with Johnson was taking a line and going all the way down this way into the Buffalo Creek. This became the Buffalo Creek Reservation. By doing this, the mouth of Buffalo Creek became part of the village of Buffalo, which gave it the chance to be able to become the main area and what was Ellicott's main thing, to sell all the lots within the area. In fact, what he did with a guy named William Peacock, they started laying out the city of Buffalo. There's all the different streets. In fact, there's the original street names. You have all the Dutch names of the people from the Holland Land Company. So different streets had different names before they really finally switched over to an Americanized version. The Indian names retained everything. Now, Ellicott ended up picking out his own lot. That was Ellicott's lot. Look at the size of that thing. Oh my God. Okay. In fact, that was actually 100 acres of land right on Main Street. That's where Ellicott was going to live. Well, we're going to find out he ended up not moving to Buffalo, but where his land was is where the Ellicott Square building is today. So if you go to Buffalo, that's where and that was actually when it was built, the biggest office building in the United States. A guy by the name of Asa Ransom was a silversmith. He was in the Finger Lakes where he was trading with the Haudenosaunee. After the Americans ended up winning the American Revolution and Fort Niagara transitioned over to American jurisdiction, he decided to move to Buffalo. So in 1797, he arrived in Buffalo along with his wife and their first daughter. Their second daughter was born in 1798 in the village of Buffalo. She was the first white female born in Buffalo, other than a child born at either Fort Erie or Fort Niagara. In 1799, the Holland Land Company offered 10 lots of 10 miles apart to any person who'd build and operate a tavern. Well, Asa and his wife purchased 150 acres at $2 an acre with no interest, okay, in what was known as Tanumnogano, called the place of the hickory bark. That became Clarence. If you're familiar with the suburb of Clarence, okay, for $300. I don't think you could even buy a piece of sidewalk in the Spalding Lake community. And they ended up getting all of Clarence. Something's going on here, okay? Well, anyways, they built a 2-story log home with a tavern and a sawmill. And it was the first hotel outside of the city of Buffalo. Their son, Harry Bolton Ransom, was born in 1799. He was the first white male child born in Erie County. So Asa Ransom is credited as being the father of the first boy and girl born in Erie County. Ladies, let me ask you a question. Don't you think Keziah had more to do with that than Asa? Keziah was his wife. We should be talking about Keziah Ransom all the time, not Asa Ransom. Okay? Well, anyways, Ransom also got a loan of $134 from the Holland Land Company to open a distillery. So the people that owned all the land, they gave somebody that lived there the money to open up a still. Okay, says something else about the people from Buffalo. Okay, well, the current Asa Ransom house was actually built in 1853. You can see it up there. It just changed ownership last year. It's still going to be as nice as it ever was if you have ever gone there. But the actual original house and tavern were actually closer to Ransom Road. If you go behind the inn, you can find an old mill and railroad trestle, which shows where it was. Well, his brother Elias moved to the current location of Snyder, about 2 miles west of Williamsville. So that's in between Williamsville and Buffalo. And in 1808, the first meeting of Clarence was actually held at Asa Ransom Brothers Tavern. Timothy Hopkins, okay, it's a name, Hopkins name you hear all over the place in Western New York. He was the half-brother of Asa and Elias Ransom. He ended up moving to Clarence in 1800. They ended up clearing land east of Clarence, so that would have been between Clarence coming over this way towards Batavia. And it was the first wheat on the Holland Land Company property. They had to travel all the way to Chippewa, Ontario to have that wheat ground. It was a 4-day trip. And that didn't change until Asa Ransom opened his own grist mill in 1805 in Clarence. Well, Hopkins then moved over to the farm of Elias Ransom, who we spoke about. And there he helped Elias build the first frame house and barn and planted the first orchard within Holland Land Company land. He married Nancy Kerr in 1804 at the Evans House in Williamsville. That was the first recorded marriage in Erie County. And they ended up building a log home replaced by a stone house where Amherst High School is today. That's not far from where Damon College is. And he and his wife raised 9 children and lived in that home for 50 years. He was a militiaman and a general during the War of 1812. He was the first supervisor, and he was the first justice of the peace, and he built the first school in Williamsville. That school building is still there in Williamsville on, I believe, Cayuga. And in Amherst, Hopkins Road is named after his son Timothy. And in the city of Buffalo, Hopkins Street is named after their son, Nelson. The Great Iroquois Trail started really at the mouth of Buffalo Creek, and it ended up going past Cold Springs through Amherst, Clarence, Akron, Batavia to Avon on the Genesee River. In 1801, your Joseph Ellicott hired White Seneca, he was a native Seneca, to clear that 50-mile road and expand it over dry land to accommodate something as wide as ox carts to be able to get to Buffalo. And that road actually followed the path that went along the crest of the Onondaga Escarpment for most of the distance. What's it called now? Main Street, or Route 5. Okay? And it was along that trail on October 1st of 1799 that Benjamin Ellicott, pictured there, with John Thompson, purchased 300 acres at $2 an acre for the land around 11 Mile Creek, including the milling rights at that creek. Well, of course, as you know, Benjamin was the brother of Joseph Ellicott. He was also a surveyor. He helped him with the buffalo. This was the earliest land transaction of the Holland Land Company in Amherst. So you hear that correctly. An employee and the brother of the manager of the Holland Land Company purchased Williamsville for $600. I live in Williamsville. That's my property taxes for 1 month. And that's for one house. Okay, he got the whole village for $600. Nepotism. He gave that to his brother for that low price. Well, anyways, Thompson ended up building a mill on the east side of 11 Mile Creek. Oh, I keep saying 11 Mile Creek. What's it called now? Ellicott Creek. Okay. And a log home diagonally across the street, which you can see right there. And that was the first permanent residence built in Williamsville. And it actually remained in the Evans family until it was demolished in 1955. Now there's just a historic marker in front of Ed Young's Hardware saying this is where the Evans house used to be. Well, neither Benjamin nor Joseph Ellicott married, so they didn't have any heirs. They were too busy selling land to each other. And so 3 of their sisters married men from the Evans family. A little strange, you know, 3 of your sisters married 3 guys from the Evans family. Well, there weren't as many people back then, I guess, okay. Well, so they left the estates to their sisters along with their sisters' children and grandchildren. So you don't hear a lot about accomplishments by people from the Ellicott family, but you hear a lot about people from the Evans family. In fact, these are things that people from the Evans family ended up accomplishing. Jonas Williams, okay, arrived in Western New York to work as a clerk for the Holland Land Company. And along with David Evans, the nephew of Joseph Ellicott, in 1808, they purchased land and the property improvements next to Glen Falls, originally owned by Benjamin and Thompson. Well, Jonas was a very cultured, well-educated individual. A sharp contrast between the rugged, self-educated pioneers that lived in the Williamsville area. David ended up returning to Philadelphia, but Williams ended up remaining in the village. He ran the mills, so they ended up calling it Williams Mills, which ended up becoming Williamsville. So that's how it ended up getting its name. Well, Williams built his home on South Cayuga, and he improved the mill property above and below Glens Falls. He died in 1820. His remains were buried at the back of his lot. They never found his remains until in 1969 they were building a parking lot for Amherst Town Hall. Lo and behold, what have they found? Jonas Williams' skeleton all the way in the back of the land. William Hall was actually a Revolutionary War hero, and other Holland Land Company sales outside of the Clarence-Williamsville area and the village of Buffalo were really in the area of Clarence and what we now call Lancaster. Why was it that that was where the early sales were? Okay, because they were natural openings in the forest. Everything used to be trees upon trees upon trees. So these are natural openings, so it was easier to put farms there. Okay, Amos and James Woodward took an article on a lot, building a Yankee log cabin known as the Gimple Cabin. That's the cabin right there. What is taking an article? Taking an article was how the Holland Land Company really sold land. If a purchaser didn't have the money to buy something outright, what you did is you made a small down payment, and you ended up promising to work at cleaning up and improving that land for a period of 10 years. Okay, most of the settlers got a deed at the end of that time, but some never completely improving it or paying for it, so they ended up losing the deed. That Warren Hall guy ended up coming with his cousin, and they took an article on a lot on a new road that was being built called Batavia Road. Batavia Road is now called Genesee Street or Route 33. That was a road that Ellicott planned to build from Buffalo to Batavia because it was more of a straight route than the Main Street route, which is more of a roundabout way. Well, that road started to be built in 1805. It wasn't completed until 1808. But now the Warren House, which you can see there, that is the oldest remaining stone house in Erie County. And if you've never gone to it, they have a whole bunch of reenactments there and such during the summertime. And in the Western New York area, all the towns, they really had their first people, that lived there. Here's a list of the people that really settled each one of the places. Trying to go into and talk about every one of them would be redundant. I really cover that in the book, and I'm sure there's a whole bunch of literature here at the Holland Land Company that goes into these people. But back in the city of Buffalo, the first lot sold by the Holland Land Company was lot number 30 at the corner of Main Street and the Terrace. It was sold to William Johnson, that's the guy that the Indians gave a whole bunch of land to, and included the former Asa Ransom log home. That was the 4th house built in Buffalo. And it also included Gillett's Coffee Shop. Yes, Gillis Coffee Shop, it preceded Decco's, your host, Tim Hortons, and Starbucks. So you could have went there to get coffee a long time ago, before then. The map on the left shows some of the inner and outer lots all the way back in 1804. Note Little Buffalo Creek, right here. This is where the terminus of the Erie Canal ends up being Little Buffalo Creek. It's not there anymore. And the other map shows the names of the first settlers that were in the Buffalo area. Cyrenius Chapin was the first doctor to practice medicine in Buffalo. He came here in 1801 and he had a group of 40 settlers. And they wanted to end up actually buying the entire village of Buffalo. They had enough money and people to be able to do it. Well, Joseph Ellicott turned him down. Why? Because he and Peacock hadn't yet finished surveying all the lots and identifying everything that they were going to sell. He returned in 1803. The lots still weren't available. So what he did is he ended up settling in Fort Erie, Canada. And from there he saw patients in Canada and all the way through the US. He finally bought a lot in 1805. There it is. Okay, that was Dr. Chapin's lot. Okay, so that's where he finally ended up settling. Captain Samuel Pratt was impressed by the location of Buffalo. He came here on a fur trading trip because he was living up in Vermont area and he was trading out of Montreal. Well, he came to Buffalo in 1804 and he said, I'm going to bring my family here. So they moved to Buffalo. They brought the first carriage to Buffalo. He built a store and a home at the corner of Exchange and Main, and the store became the main trading location with the Senecas. And Pratt was always called an honest dealer and merciful man by the Haudenosaunee. His 2.5-story home was the first frame house built in Buffalo. They called it the Mansion. Okay, it was rebuilt after the War of 1812, and in its location, the Mansion House was built. That was the main tavern and hotel within the Buffalo area. In fact, American Express and Wells Fargo were actually formed inside of that building. They weren't formed in New York City, they were formed right in the good old Buffalo, New York. Pratt also bought 100 acres of land on both sides of the Buffalo River, and he operated a ferry service going across the river before he replaced it with the toll bridge. That ended up becoming Ohio Street. He was also involved in a whole bunch of public improvements and doing things with churches and schools in the area. Louis Le Courtelaux, my apologies if I mispronounced, I told you I'm language dumb. Okay, he was a French nobleman. He actually fled to America during the French Revolution. I guess coming to America was much better than facing the guillotine, right? And he was a relative of the Marquis de Lafayette. And he was associated with Robert Morris, who we spoke about earlier, in George Washington. In 1804, he purchased a lot at the corner of Main and Exchange, across the street from where Pratt had a store. That was the first drugstore. Now, he was an immaculately dressed person, very stylish clothing. In fact, in the 1810 census, when they talked to him, they asked him what his occupation was. He didn't say a druggist. He said, I'm a gentleman. And when he walked around town, he looked like a gentleman. And so even before he purchased a lot, he ended up saying to Joseph Ellicott that a canal should be built from Black Rock to the mouth of Buffalo Creek, because we could have a good harbor in Buffalo. Smart guy. Okay. He also donated land to various institutions. The building there that you can see is St. Mary's Institution for the Deaf on the corner of Edward and Elmwood. And he also donated the land for St. Louis Church, which is on the corner of Main and Edward Streets. Erastus Granger was a friend of Thomas Jefferson. He actually became friends with Jefferson before Jefferson became president. Well, political patronage goes all the way back 200 years, I'm sorry to say, because when Granger came to Buffalo in 1803, because of the fact that he was associated with Jefferson, he was named Superintendent of Indian Affairs, Collector of Customs at the harbor, and the Postmaster. He purchased land on Main Street in between Exchange and Seneca, and there he built an Indian agency in his own house. But what he also did is he purchased a 700-acre farm 4 miles from the city. That was considered far away. Okay, 4 miles. Oh my God, it probably took you half a day to get there. Okay, and that was called Flint Hill. Upon the grounds of Flint Hill was a sacred Seneca site called the Council of the Oaks of the Seneca. There he met with Red Jacket, Farmer's Brother, and Corn Planter, and asked them to stay out of the War of 1812. But the Mohawks in eastern New York joined the British, so the Seneca said, we love you, Granger, we're going to end up fighting with the Americans. Well, some of the early other residents of the Buffalo area before the War of 1812 are listed here. And of course, Hodge, Walden, Johnson, Coit, and Townsend all became very influential people in the community. The other thing I have to point out, I'm sorry to have to continually do this, but look at all these tavern owners. What is it with the city of Buffalo? Okay, tavern owners every place, you know? Well, the Battle of Queenston Heights actually started. This is at the very beginning of the War of 1812, where they were firing cannons at each other from Lewiston over to the other side of the gorge in Queenston. Well, the Americans ended up going across, and they ended up capturing the land. They ended up getting up to the top. They were winning, and they had a whole bunch of American militia that were ready to join them. Well, the militia saw these wounded people coming back across the river. They saw these dead bodies coming across the river. And they said, we are New York State militiamen. There's nothing in our agreement that we have to fight in another country. So they refused to cross the Niagara River and fight in Canada. Because of that, the British ended up winning the Battle of Queenston Heights. They captured over 400 Americans, but of course the British lost General Brock. Okay, and that's that big monument you see when you're in Lewiston looking across. Well, many of the battles of the War of 1812 were fought on the Niagara Peninsula. In the rest of the United States, unless you lived in Washington, D.C., when your entire city and the White House was burned, or you happen to live in New Orleans, which had the last battle of the War of 1812, you didn't know about it that much. But here, a lot of it went on. Okay, after the Battle of Lewiston Heights, the American regular troops and militia quartered in Delaware Park in the Meadows. William Hodge, who we mentioned, he had a tavern called the Tavern on the Hill at the corner of Main and Utica, not far from the Delaware Park encampment. And all the American soldiers would come there and, you know, go to his store, go to his tavern and everything like that. But the winter of 1812, 1813 was a very, very, very cold winter. Okay, the United States Army did not send proper winter clothing or supplies for the troops. Okay, many of the soldiers were from the South. They weren't familiar with winter weather. And they ended up dying from exposure, frostbite, pneumonia, and other diseases. Not injuries, okay, from them diseases. The ground was too frozen to bury the dead, so they stacked all the dead soldiers inside of tents. And when spring started to come, and you could dig into the ground, they ended up burying all these soldiers without any coffins. Well, unfortunately, if you go through, familiar with Buffalo, you're going down Route 33, and you got where it turns into the 198, and there's all this rock strata. Okay, right below the land there, it's not that deep. So they buried these 300 soldiers in the ground, and it wasn't deep enough. When the snow melted, our arms and legs were all sticking out of the ground. It was absolutely disgusting. So they ended up hiring Hodge to build 300 coffins to bury these soldiers. Those soldiers were buried in Delaware Park. There's the original monument. Still, till this day, they're still buried in Delaware Park, and they are in between the 3rd green and the 4th tee-off box at the golf course. So if you ever go to Delaware Park, there were 300 American heroes buried inside of that park that never get, the accolades that they should get, for that happening. Well, Commodore Perry, you heard of him, okay? He started building ships in the Black Rock Harbor. And where they built that was where Skedackota Creek ends up coming out into the Niagara River. And during the winter of 1812 and 1813, he refitted 5 ships. 3 of those ships ended up participating in the Battle of Lake Erie in September of 1813, which ended up giving the Americans control of Lake Erie for all the rest of the War of 1812. Well, when the regular American troops were transferred to Sackett's Harbor, Fort George, which would be the fort across from Fort Niagara, was just manned by American militia and Canadian volunteers. Canadian volunteers were former Americans that lived in Canada and they offered to serve with the United States. Well, the term for the militiamen was about to expire in early December. So the American general, General George McClure, did not have sufficient regular troops to defend the fort, so he decided he was going to abandon it. He was going to burn the fort. but he was also going to burn the village of Niagara-on-the-Lake. And what he did is he ended up burning it in December when it was really cold, with 400 civilians ended up losing their homes. That's a no-no. You don't do that to people during a war. Okay, well, in the evening of December 18th, 560 British regulars crossed the Niagara. They snuck across, they got into Youngstown, they overwhelmed the guards, they marched into Fort Niagara, they surprised everybody that was there, and only 20 Americans escaped. Okay, all the rest were killed, wounded, and 344 of them were captured. The British only lost 6 men. But now the British ended up having control of Fort Niagara on the American side. It was time for retaliation. What the British did is they ended up sending General Riall, R-I-A-L-L, on a campaign to burn Lewiston and Manchester. Manchester? What's Manchester? Oh, Niagara Falls. Okay. So they ended up burning Lewiston and Manchester. And afterwards, they went back to Canada, came back across Niagara River to attack Black Rock. We mentioned Serenius Chapin. He was the first doctor in Buffalo. He was also a colonel during the War of 1812, not treating the troops as a colonel fighting in the wars. He was doing raids. And he tried to protect Black Rock. He retreated. He ended up setting up a cannon on the corner of Main and Niagara Streets in Buffalo. You can see the picture right there. And they were going to try to protect the city from the British attack. He was assisted by a force of about 30 men. What happened? After firing a couple times, the cannon broke down. Okay, so Chapin says, okay, I surrender. Well, surrendering is surrendering, but then surrendering is surrendering. Okay, if you could follow that, good luck. Okay, what happened is General Riall found out that Chapin was not the commanding officer. The commanding officer is the only person that can surrender. Since Chapin wasn't the commanding officer, he couldn't surrender. So he refused to accept his surrender. Okay, but that was good. Okay, because it might not have stopped Buffalo from being burned, but what it did is it gave people a chance to escape before the British ended up burning the city. The British, along with, of course, the Mohawks that were working with them. And so they ended up burning the city of Buffalo. But when you hear Buffalo was burned, you think, wow, that must have been something. Buffalo was small back then. That is the entire area of the city of Buffalo. Okay, it consisted of only like 100 buildings. It went from Exchange Street to Chippewa and Franklin to Washington. That was the entire city of Buffalo. So they burned it, but it wasn't all that tough. Well, in 1807, the St. John family ended up moving to Williamsville. In 1810, they moved to Buffalo, where they built a home and a tavern at 860 Main Street. Earlier in the War of 1812, Margaret lost one of her sons to distemper, which he picked up at one of the soldiers' barracks. Later, her husband and another son were trying to deliver supplies to Fort Erie. Their boat capsized, and both her husband and son died. So the British started to attack everything, and Mrs. St. John's son-in-law gathered his wife and 6 of Mrs. St. John's younger children in his wagon. They tried to flee to Williamsville. The road was blocked. So they fled towards Hamburg over Buffalo Creek at Pratt's Ferry. He said he will return. Well, MacArthur said that too. He didn't make it back. Okay, MacArthur eventually did. Okay, well, Margaret pleaded with the British and General Riall not to burn her house down, because she said, I've already lost my husband and 2 of my sons during this war. Save my house. So he assigned an interpreter and stationed him in front of the house, and they ended up fending off some of the Indians, but they still ended up saving the home. So Mrs. St. John's house, the jail, and the blacksmith shop were the only buildings not burned in the city of Buffalo during the War of 1812. And now you always hear Buffalo was burned during the War of 1812. It was actually burned on the last days of 1813 going into 1814. So that's when Buffalo was burned. Mrs. Sarah Lovejoy lived across the street from the St. John family at 465 Main Street. That's where Hinger's department store later was located. And she refused to cooperate with the Indians. She was the only civilian casualty during the Battle of Buffalo. Well, at the advent of the War of 1812, troops gathered at Ellicott Creek, and they put their army on Garrison Road in Williamsville. In fact, that's how Garrison Road ended up getting its name. In 1813, the barracks were expanded into a hospital where they treated sick and wounded American soldiers and British prisoners. In the spring of 1814, there was actually 5,000 to 6,000 Army guys stationed inside of Williamsville. That's like going to Thursday, Music on Thursday right now in Williamsville, people all over the place. And General Scott ended up staying in the Evans House. And Timothy Hopkins, who we mentioned, built an arsenal across the street, where St. Peter and Paul's churches, that's where he had all of his troops. Well, all the people that died at the hospital were buried at the cemetery on Arrow Drive. There's an early picture of it, and that's like what it looks like now. But of those people that died, most of them died of dysentery or diarrhea, not from battle wounds. So during the War of 1812, most of your deaths were caused by other causes. There was a major called Ludwig Morgan. He was the hero of the Battle of Conjuncta Creek. You all know Conjuncta Creek, right? Even though you're out in Batavia, Conjuncta Creek is like a second-hand word to everybody. No? I didn't think so. Well, they changed the name to Skajackwada Creek. We heard of that one, okay? Well, after the Battle of Lundy's Lane, the Americans fell right back to Fort Erie and Buffalo. Fort Erie was supplied by shipments from Buffalo and Black Rock, so the British decided to attack Buffalo again. Oh, they were going to burn us one more time. Well, Major Morgan, with his force of 140 men, had a whole bunch of Kentucky sharpshooters. And what they did is every night, they went down to where the only bridge was that went over Skajackwada Creek. And right now it's actually near Grant Street, where Buffalo State College is, or for any of you music people, not far from where the Sportsman's Tavern is. I think of everything as taverns because I'm from Buffalo. Okay, also I've been in music all my life. Okay, and so every night they would take all the planks out of the bridge. Okay, so the British came down Skajackwada Creek and they said, "Ooh, a bridge! Let's cross over here." It was dark out, so they started crossing, and what happened? They all got congested trying to get across the bridge because you can see part of the way out you could go and everything was there. The sharpshooters picked them all off. So all the British ended up either being shot by the Kentucky sharpshooters or falling into the creek. Okay, the Americans were outnumbered 5-1 and they beat the British. Why is that important? If the British would have won that battle, they could have burned Buffalo again. It could have changed the entire complexion of what happened during the War of 1812. But then we had the siege of Fort Erie. Okay, after Lundy's Lane, General Gaines fell back to defend Fort Erie, and he rebuilt all the defenses. So when the British general came back, he found out that they'd done a great job, so they started a siege of the fort. Okay, after a couple of weeks, they ended up finally breaching the defenses, and there was a big explosion in the ammunition area that ended up causing 905 casualties. Well, the British retreated out into the woods, and there were some skirmishes. Well, General Porter, who we're going to talk about more in a few minutes, convinced 2,200 militia to finally cross into Canada. Remember in Lewiston, they didn't want to go across? Well, now they're going to go across. And he ended up sending them across. They ended up taking the entire fort. We ended up winning. The Americans ended up finally blowing up Fort Erie and coming back to Buffalo. Then in February of 1815, they ratified the Treaty of Ghent, and peace finally returned to the U.S.-Canadian border, except for games between the Maple Leafs and the Sabres, but usually it's pretty calm. Okay, and well, after the Devil's Hole massacre, as we said, the Seneca had to cede 1 mile strip of land, and that becomes the mile strip or the mile reserve. That was put up for sale along with leases on Lewiston and Fort Slocia. Who got the leases? Peter Porter, Augustus Porter, Joseph Annam, and Benjamin Barton. They ended up purchasing all this land and they won the leases. And Porter, of course, was a Yale-trained lawyer. His brother, Augustus Porter, was a surveyor who worked for Joseph Ellicott. God, I can see why we're in this building. His name comes up all over the place in the history of this area. Well, by winning the bids, they ended up for having the land in Lewiston and Fort Slocia. They formed a portage company called Porter, Barton and Company. And it took everything from Lake Ontario to Lake Erie. And Porter, of course, lived in Black Rock, and he was elected to the House of Representatives. Augustus Porter and Peter Porter purchased all the land above and below Niagara Falls. They even bought Goat Island. And when Augustus moved to Niagara Falls, he opened a store. He was the first judge and the first postmaster. Later in history, the Porter family ended up selling Niagara Falls to New York State, which became the first state park in the United States. And that's a whole nother story. But anyways, after Benjamin Barton ended up helping the Porters in Niagara Falls, he ended up moving to Lewiston. He built this home, which is right on top of the hill off of Center Street. So if you ever go to the Lewiston Art Festival, you can still see that house. It's still standing there. But all the company's holdings, of course, were burned during the War of 1812. All the stuff was rebuilt. There's a guy by the name of Samuel Wilkeson. To me, Samuel Wilkeson is like the father of Buffalo. Okay? He moved to Buffalo during the War of 1812, and he started building ships with Commodore Perry. And he was the first justice of the peace in Buffalo. And his home was on Niagara Square. That is the location now of Buffalo City Hall. So the guy that did all these things lived where City Hall is today. He formed the Buffalo Harbor Company with Ebenezer Johnson, Ebenezer Walden, Charles Townsend, George Coit, and Oliver Forward. And what they did is they removed the sandbar, okay, which blocked off the mouth of the Buffalo River. So originally, if you look at this picture, the river went like this. So the river would have went this way. What they ended up doing is moving the mouth of the river 1,000 feet south. Because of that, the sandbar never accumulated, and you ended up creating a harbor for Buffalo, okay? Which was very important because Buffalo had been named the port of entry in 1805. It ended up going back to Black Rock being the port of entry. And there was the big thing. They're going to build something called the Erie Canal. What's going to be the western terminus of the Erie Canal? Well, they were hoping by making Buffalo Harbor that would happen. Well, in 1809, Ebenezer Johnson ended up coming to Buffalo. He was also a doctor who was here, Chapin. Not enough room for 2 doctors. Town was too small. So he ended up treating the wounded during the War of 1812. He came back to Buffalo. And he got involved with Wilkeson in developing the harbor. Wilkeson and Johnson also got the contract in 1823 to build a dam at the mouth of Tonawanda Creek in Tonawanda. And they put a toll bridge going across the creek. So the person that was the first judge of Buffalo and considered the father of Buffalo were also responsible for Tonawanda and North Tonawanda. Okay, we mentioned Coit and Thompson. They also worked with Wilkeson. What they did is they moved to Buffalo in 1811 and opened a drugstore in the corner of Swan and Pearl. The day before the city of Buffalo was going to be burned, they filled up a wagon and took all their merchandise to Williamsville. Smart, because then the city was burned. They came back, the original store was built to the ground, so they ended up purchasing another lot on Erie Street. On the location of their original store, they built the Coit House. That's the Coit House in the top picture. It was built in 1815. It was the first house built in Buffalo after the War of 1812. It was located diagonally across the street from the Pearl Street Pub. And they ended up moving that house in 1867 to Virginia and Elmwood. That's the house today. So that is the oldest house in Buffalo, and it was done by Coit, who's one of the people that started the harbor. Well, how did he do that? Well, Coit married Townsend's sister, Hannah. They raised 8 children inside of that house on the corner of Main and Swan. And in 1816, they registered the first ship in Buffalo Creek. What did they call it? The Hannah, for his wife and for Townsend's sister. And when the construction of the Erie Canal began in 1817, they built a dock and a warehouse at the foot of Commercial Street at the mouth of Little Buffalo Creek. Remember I mentioned Little Buffalo Creek? And it was called the Red Warehouse. Well, when they were developing Canal Side in Buffalo, they ended up digging up the commercial slip, and they ended up actually finding the Coit Warehouse. In fact, that building today is where the Liberty Hound restaurant is and the Naval Park Museum. But of course, the argument over what was going to be the western terminus of the Erie Canal actually was still going on. In 1816, the construction project was approved by New York State. But still, they didn't know where the terminus was going to be. Well, Buffalo and Black Rock are only 3 miles apart. Then 3 miles were all forests. You didn't know they were 3 miles apart. It was like acres and lands apart. Well, Black Rock was larger and busier than Buffalo. It was upstream and it had a better harbor, okay, and shelter from the river, okay. And unfortunately, there was a strong current, so you could not get ships out of there, just like it took LaSalle's ship all the time to get all the way from Niagara Falls to the mouth of the river. So the terminus kept going back and forth as they were building it. Wilkinson was arguing for the merits of Buffalo. Porter was arguing for the merits of Black Rock. Finally, with construction reaching Buffalo in the spring of 1825, they decided to make Buffalo the terminus of the Erie Canal. What would have happened if Black Rock won? Okay, if Black Rock would have won, we'd probably be now cheering for the Black Rock Boulders on Sundays instead of the Buffalo Bills. Possibility, you never know. And of course, Black Rock ended up getting absorbed into Buffalo. At the grand opening of the Erie Canal, okay, they had a cannonade, meaning as soon as one cannon heard the cannon explode, the next one shot off. And I'm sure somebody here knows. How long did it take for that cannonade to get all the way from Buffalo to Manhattan?
How many hours, days?
90 minutes. It only took 90 minutes. You heard the cannon explode, and the next one went, and it only took 90 minutes to be able to get there. And Governor Clinton ended up came to Buffalo. He boarded the Seneca Chief, owned by Coit, and they took a keg of water from Buffalo, and they ended up dumping it in Lake Erie. That was 10 days later. The cannonade was only 90 minutes. And that ceremony was called the Wedding of the Waters. Some interesting facts of the Erie Canal. It reduced the time of travel from Albany to Buffalo from 2 weeks to 5 days. The original canal was 363 miles long, second longest in the world. Where's the longest canal? Where else? China. They have the wall, I guess they also have the canal. It was originally only 40 feet wide and 4 feet deep. There's a 569-foot difference in elevation from the Hudson River to Lake Erie. To be able to make up for that difference in height, they had to build 83 locks and 18 aqueducts to be able to make the Erie Canal work to go across the state. The budget of $7 million was approved in 1817. $7 million is $170 million today. So it's really not that much. The job came in at $7.143 million to build it. So they were almost completely on budget to build the Erie Canal. It was paid, the construction costs were paid after the first year of operation. So it only took 1 year to cover the entire cost of the Erie Canal. The workers are mostly Irish, and they were paid $10 a month. To motivate the workers, what did they do? They put a case of whiskey every 10 miles, and as soon as they got to the case of whiskey, everybody got to drink the whiskey. Okay, they were Irish. Okay, it definitely motivated them. Okay, and they lived in Buffalo. No. Well, in Buffalo, after the canal opened, a guy by the name of Mortis Emanuel Noah tried to set up the city of Ararat on Grand Island as a home to the Jews. In 1820, he got New York State permission for the idea of purchasing Grand Island to be the Jewish state for Jewish people from all around the world. He spent 5 years trying to raise the money. Finally, in 1825, he ended up buying over 2,500 acres of Grand Island. Well, he announced that it was going to be built. He had a cornerstone built. And he asked for every Jew in America to contribute 3 shekels a year. How much is 3 shekels? $1. Okay. And he asked all the Jewish people in the rest of the world to donate money towards it. Well, the people in America didn't want to give the $1 a year, and nobody in Europe liked the idea. So by the end of 1825, the idea of Grand Island becoming the Jewish settlement for everybody, Jews in the entire world, evaporated. But can you imagine how different Western New York would have been if Grand Island became the home for all the Jewish people in the world? And another thing which happened way in the future, Grand Island almost became the home of the United Nations. Okay, that was going to be on the island just on the other side of Grand Island. Then somebody named Rockefeller decided to donate his land to New York City. And Disney World almost built a park on Grand Island. So what would have happened if that was the Jewish state and it was also the United Nations and we had Disney World here? My God, the stretch would probably be coming all the way out to Batavia for people living there. Okay, Lewis Allen ended up coming to Buffalo in 1827. In 1829, he purchased 29 acres of land on Main Street, right at an area called Allen Street. And if you ever notice Allen Street, it's not a straight road. You know, most people go to Allen Street, there's so many bars there. The road is not curved because of the bars. The road is curved because every morning Lewis Allen would walk his cows down that street to pasture at Days Park. Cows don't walk in a straight line. So that's why Allen Street curves. Well, in 1833, he ended up working for a company called the East Boston Lumber Company. All the land that Noah had in Grand Island, they ended up buying to harvest all the white oak that existed on Long Island. So Allen purchased for that lumber company 16,000 acres of land in Grand Island at $6 an acre. You know how much money that is? That's less than $100,000. So if less than $100,000 could have bought you Grand Island. I wish I lived in another time period and knew what was going to happen. Well, anyways, after that project ended up going down on Grand Island, Allen purchased 600 acres and built himself a farm called Allenton. There he did research on planting, milk production, fruit trees, and he built a home on the land that was used by his son and by his nephew, some guy by the name of Grover Cleveland. And well, he also purchased the former Peter Porter mansion, Niagara Street. And it was at this home that Allen convinced Grover Cleveland to stay in Buffalo and study law, rather than going to Ohio to study law. Because of that, Grover Cleveland became the sheriff of Buffalo, the mayor of Buffalo, the governor of New York State, all because Allen ended up talking him into staying. But there's an irony to this story. Allen was a Republican. In fact, he was in charge of the Republican Party for Western New York. Cleveland was a Democrat. They ended up parting ways, and Allen never voted for his nephew in any election. Okay. Well, Allen also started a private club, okay, called the Falcon, which ended up becoming Beaver Island State Park. And because of his farming interest, Allen was responsible for restarting the Erie County Fair. First one was held behind the courthouse in downtown Buffalo, right near where the Buffalo Library is today. Stephen White is the guy that was from the East Boston Company, purchased Tonawanda Island. And he built a mansion there. You can see a picture of the mansion and a picture in the top. And one of the owners of that lumber company was a politician and lawyer called Daniel Webster. Okay, well, Webster spent a lot of time at the mansion. His son Fletcher ended up marrying White's daughter in 1836. If you're familiar with North Tonawanda, the main street in North Tonawanda is named Webster Street, named after Daniel Webster. Well, after the white oak of Grand Island was cut down by 1840, other lumber companies started coming in to Tonawanda and North Tonawanda. Because with the air going along the Niagara Strait, okay, it was perfect for storing, processing, and clearing the lumber. Between 1880 and 1890, there's a ferry landing in Tonawanda, which is now part of Niawanda Park. From there all the way to Gratwood Park in North Tonawanda, there were 7 miles of docks, and lumber in some places was stacked 14 feet high. North Tonawanda and Tonawanda became the lumber capital of the world in 1890. And for 70 years, almost 100% of the economy of the Tonawandas was from lumber. Talking about presidents, Millard Fillmore was also from the Western New York area. He moved here when he was 21 years old in 1821. His parents lived in East Aurora, and what he did is he taught at the Cold Spring School at the corner of Main and Utica. That top building is where Fillmore taught, okay, in the city of Buffalo. And he also studied law. Well, what he ended up doing is building a home for Abigail Powers, who was his teacher. Hold it, he married his teacher? Well, back then, some people went to school when they were old, so she was only a year older than that. So I guess it was okay. But anyway, so he built her that home in East Aurora, which was right next door to the Aurora Theater. His law office was diagonally across the street. Diagonally across the street is Vidler's department store. So that being the President of the United States' original law office was inside of a 5 and 10. Okay. Well, his practice grew and grew, and he ended up building this house on Franklin Street in Buffalo. He kept that while he was president. He became vice president, and after Taylor died, he became president. When he came back to Buffalo, he purchased what he called a more presidential-style mansion on Niagara Square. That's on Niagara Square. Where that stood is where the Hotel Stanley is today. I consider, in my mind, Fillmore's the favorite son of Buffalo. Why? He came back to Buffalo and devoted his entire life to helping the Buffalo area. He started the UB Medical School, he started the Buffalo Club, he started the Early History Museum, he started the Buffalo Museum of Science, he started the SPCA. It had something to do with starting the school system. And of course there's the UB campus, which he was the first chancellor of. He did all those things for Buffalo. And religiously, St. John Newman, who was born in Bohemia, part of the Czech Republic, immigrated to the US in 1836. He was ordained at St. Patrick's in New York City and sent to Western New York. Why? He spoke 8 languages. And in the Williamsville area, there was a lot of German people. So when he got here, they wanted him to reside at St. Louis Church in Buffalo, but he ended up saying, I'm going to be where my parish is, St. Peter's and Paul's in Williamsville. Well, there was no rectory there. In fact, the church wasn't even done when he moved there. So he stayed at people's houses, and he had a room at the Eagle House, the restaurant in Williamsville, okay? In fact, I had a fish fry there on Good Friday, and I saw this apparition of a priest coming down the stairs, dressed, just like a priest would be back then. And he says, hey, you want to go to the bar and have a German beer with me? And I said, no, that's okay. So I almost had a beer with a saint, because Newman ended up becoming the first saint in America because of what he did after he left Buffalo. He ended up forming all the Catholic schools in Philadelphia. But before he did that, he was the pastor of St. John the Baptist Church in North Bush. Huh? Oh, Tonawanda. Okay. And Benjamin Rathbun was, I'd say, one of the biggest characters, really, in the history of Buffalo. He built Buffalo when he lost it. He arrived all the way back in 1819. He bought the Eagle Tavern at the Eagle House in downtown Buffalo, which was the stagecoach stop. He established the stagecoach lines from Buffalo to Albany. In 1835, he built 99 buildings in Buffalo. He employed 2,500 people. And he built everything from like the American Hotel to the jail to the First Unitarian Church. Well, there was a lot of building speculation going on in that time. Like most contractors, Rathbun overextended himself. He ran out of money. He couldn't borrow any more money. His brother and nephew came up with a great idea. Why borrow the money when we can forge the name of prominent people on promissory notes? We don't even have to extend ourselves. So they forged the names of prominent Buffalo citizens on $1.5 million in notes. Unfortunately, they got found out, okay? His brother and nephew skipped town. So they hightailed out of here, nothing happened to him. What happened to Benjamin Rathbun? They locked him up in the jail he built for the city of Buffalo. Well, Joseph Dart and Robert Dunbar, okay, really what put Buffalo on the map, because they were the inventors of the grain elevator. And this is what revolutionized the unloading of the Great Lakes boats and helped make Buffalo the grain capital of the United States. To give you an example, with manual labor, you could remove 2,000 bushels a day from a lake vessel. After a couple of years, the grain mills got so proficient that they could remove 2,000 bushels in 1 hour. So that's what made Buffalo the main area. Now, at the very beginning of this talk, I mentioned the Pratt family. Okay, Samuel Pratt came here as one of the first families to locate in Buffalo. His son, Samuel Pratt Jr., continued the family tradition of store ownership. His sons were Samuel Fletcher Pratt and Pascal Pioli Pratt. They built the legacy of the Pratt family. What they did is they started the S.F. Pratt & Company, which became Pratt & Company when the two brothers got together, and that became the largest retail and wholesale hardware company in the country. In 1948, Samuel and Pascal formed Pratt & Letchworth with William Letchworth, whose summer home ended up becoming Letchworth State Park. In fact, I was just there and I ended up staying at the Glen Iris, which was his home. Great trip. I loved it. Okay, the company was originally the manufacturer of saddlery and coach hardware, and they expanded into malleable steel and iron castings. In Black Rock, they ended up employing over 1,800 people. Samuel, one of the brothers, formed the Buffalo Gas Company and the Buffalo Female Academy. Pascal was one of the big proponents of getting people to move to Buffalo. He got together with Bronson Rumsey, whose family owned over 1/2 of the city of Buffalo, And they found out there was no bank to get money from, so what did they do? They started M&T Bank. So truthfully, it was the Pratt family that took Buffalo from the early 1800s, which is the period we were talking about, that to the manufacturing and industry of the later 1800s. A side note on the Pratt family before we end this presentation. The Pratt's ancestors were also the founding members of the Mormon Church. Parley and Orson Pratt were among the original 12 apostles of the church. Parley was the proponent for polygamy. Parley had 30 children. He was the cousin of the Pratt family that was in Buffalo. It is estimated today that he has between 30 and 50,000 living relatives. Can you imagine the Christmas shopping list? Okay, but one of his great-grandchildren, well, great-great-grandchildren, is Mitt Romney. So that's related to Buffalo. So I hope you enjoyed my trip back in time to what happened in early Buffalo, the people that were responsible for Buffalo, some of the good things and the crazy things that they did. I very much enjoyed giving you this talk, and normally at the beginning of a talk I always say I have 3 goals. I'm going to bring that up now and ask you if I accomplished my goals. Goal number 1 is I'm going to bring up some things that you never knew before. Did I do that today?
Yes.
Goal number 2 is I'm going to bring up some things that you might have forgotten and you remember because of me talking about them. Did I also accomplish that?
Yes.
Goal number 3, most important. After you heard about all these accomplishments of people from Western New York, all these great things that happened in Western New York, when you leave here today, you're going to be prouder to say, I am from Western New York. Did I accomplish that?
Yes.
Did I accomplish that?
Yes.
Thank you very much, everybody. Any questions? Yes?
First of all, anybody wants to look up Lewiston for their wonderful summer festivals. One's coming up in June. I don't know about July, but there's always the Peach Festival as well. It's a wonderful place for their events. And what happened to the stone church, which many decades ago housed McDonald's? And what did it start? I don't even
Okay,
say
that stone church,
stone building. I
that
meant
stone
to say.
building became, ever hear of Jenny Lind? I mean, Jenny Lind was like the first superstar when it comes to music. Okay, that stone building became the Frontier House. And Jenny Lind used to stay there and at the Cataract House in Niagara Falls when she spent the summer living in Western New York. It later became a McDonald's. It was the only McDonald's in the United States that didn't have the arches. And when you went inside, it still had the very historic appearance. It, I believe, had a fire and is being rebuilt and is going to be reopening this year from what I understand. And the reason I brought up Lewiston is you have the beautiful house that Barton built, which is up on that hill. And you can still see that, when, you go there. Okay? Anybody else?
Well, it's probably not easy, but Kleinhans. The Kleinhans was a clothing shop and it was also the music hall.
Okay.
It's probably not it's probably 1900s, but
Yeah,
what do you know about how'd they come to Buffalo?
Okay. Kleinhans and his brother had clothing stores in other cities. And
Okay.
Edward Kleinhans ended up moving to Buffalo. He met his wife, Mary Seton, in the South. And she was like a Southern aristocrat type lady.
Okay.
And she was totally into the arts and music.
Oh, so they are tied.
They're totally tied together.
Oh,
So
okay.
what they did is they ended up having their first store inside of the Brisbane building. They actually occupied half of the first floor and all of the second floor. Who had the other half of the first floor? Some guy by the name of Knox in a company called Woolworths. Okay,
Oh.
so the Kleinhans couple never had any children. So when they passed away, they left their entire estate to the city of Buffalo because all they cared about was the arts. So they donated the money. Franklin D. Roosevelt's policies during the Depression provided the rest of the money, and that became Kleinhans Music Hall. Because before that, the music hall happened to be what was called the Elmwood Music Hall. The Elmwood Music Hall was a former armory. The armory closed and that armory moved to the Connecticut Street Armory. Well, so you had this big building with an armory and right in front of it were the stagecoach stops. So people would say that since it was an armory and the sound echoed all over the place, during silent pieces of music, the streetcars were louder than the violins. So they ended up moving out of there, and that's why the Kleinhans wanted Kleinhans Music Hall built. So we went from a music hall that was absolutely terrible to a music hall that's considered one of the best acoustic music halls in the entire United States. His wife was Mary Seton. What's the other room inside Kleinhans Music Hall? The Mary Seton room. Okay. That's in Talk After the Talk. He's actually the early 1900s. Okay, because that's when he had his business. Okay, and like in my books, like what I talked about today, everything is inside of this book on the 1800s, plus everything that happened in the second half. Like the Rumsey family and the Sholokovs and the Goodyears, all these people have really started all the industry in Western New York. Then in the 1900s, the first half I go into people like the Kleinhans and the other people that did everything within the Western New York area. So these books really give you, I touched on everything, this goes into more detail. And I always joke, I did an interview on, remember 97 Rock? A fun radio station. We're all baby boomers. That's our station. Come on. Okay. Well, anyways, I did an interview with them after I did one of my books, and at the end of the interview, this jockey said, "You know something, Rick? You've written the best bathroom book in the past decade." And that's exactly my objective. That's my writing style. My writing style is I write it so there's no big words, so that everybody understands it. It's short, it's concise, there's funny things inside of it, and none of them are too long to get you in trouble if you're reading them when you're sitting in the bathroom.
Can I ask you one more thing that
Sure.
I always wondered? The Pan Am and McKinley being shot, that put a black mark on Buffalo, didn't it? I mean,
Yes.
they lost money, and I often wonder when
It
you're
put a black
watching.
mark. It put a black mark on Buffalo. However, what that did is that showed everybody how great Buffalo can be. It showed everybody how Buffalo's location was so fantastic. Okay, so people ended up coming to the Buffalo area because of the Pan Am, even though they had lost money. And
It's
there's never
never be a
been
big city to have the Pan Am in the first place.
There's,
to be
yeah, there's
recognized
never
as
really
money.
been a World's Fair that's made money. Now, do you know that the Pan Am was supposed to be in Niagara Falls?
No.
Okay, originally it was going to be in the LaSalle area of Niagara Falls.
Oh.
They even put a marker up for where the Pan Am was going to be. And then some little conflict started called the Spanish-American War. And they had to delay the opening of the Pan Am, and they ended up moving it to Buffalo.
Yeah.
I mentioned the Rumsey family. The Rumsey family actually donated the land to the city of Buffalo to be able to do the Pan American exhibition with the stipulation that it be returned to them in the condition that it was when they gave it to them. But the Rumseys owned 23 of the 42 square miles of the city of Buffalo. Yes?
Do you know who the president of the City of Light, where he came from?
Well, the president of the city of Light, that would have been Milburn. He was the president of the
He
Pan
came
Am.
from Batavia.
Oh,
He
Milburn's
came
from Batavia?
Ireland. He studied here law, and his sister lived here. He went on to Buffalo and later on moved on to New York City to
Yeah.
become a very prestigious.
He had the
lawyer
biggest
here.
law firm in the United States when he moved.
Yes.
There's a whole bunch of stuff about him in this book. But I didn't put that he was originally from Batavia. At least
Wow.
I don't think I had that in there. But I learn things all the time.
There you go, see?
You know.
Wow.
Go ahead.
I missed the name completely.
John Milburn. John
Oh,
Milburn.
not Milburn.
Milburn. M-I-L-B-U-R-N.
Oh,
In
yeah.
fact, after
Similar
McKinley
thing.
was shot, he was dying inside of Milburn's house, which was on the corner of Delaware and West Ferry in Buffalo. And all of the cabinet members from the United States cabinet were staying at the Buffalo House. Not the Buffalo House, the Buffalo Club on Delaware Avenue. So Buffalo actually served as the capital of the United States because the president was here and also the cabinet was here. Theodore Roosevelt got to know Wilcox when they worked together on starting Niagara Falls as the first state park. So he was staying at Wilcox's house. He was supposed to be inaugurated at the Milburn House, but he thought it wouldn't be right because the president's body was still there. So he ended up being inaugurated at the Wilcox Mansion. You know, there's so many cool things. That's why I love talking about Buffalo history. There's so many great things. Yeah.
Which book would have the most about Forest Lawn Cemetery.
Good year, Larry, good year. He'd be in there. Right.
That's a tough one. You know, because
That's
Forest Lawn
19
Cemetery
minutes.
was originally mentioned Granger. A lot of his land ended up becoming Forest Lawn. Okay, so there's actually coverage in both. However, in the 1900s book, I have a lot of the really famous monuments and people that are buried there listed inside of that book. So, you know that great expression, six of one and a half dozen of another? There's your answer.
Good.
Anybody else?
Just one other thought on McKinley. I heard he didn't die from the gunshot. He died from
Okay.
an infection because the doctor was in Niagara Falls. It was supposed to treat him or something, and it was
Okay, here we go. This is going into another talk. A guy
Yeah.
by the name of Roswell Park, when he was
Right.
31 years old, was named the chief medical person for the University of Buffalo. And he actually got his graduate studies in gunshot wounds when he went to college. And he happened to be in Niagara Falls during an operation. And he ended up coming to Buffalo. He saw the operation was already done. He didn't agree with it, but he felt like it wouldn't be his place to intervene. When Roswell Park died, he said the biggest regret in my life was not being in Buffalo because I could have saved McKinley's life. Now, what's even worse is they had an Edison X-ray machine on exhibit at the Pan American Exhibition. They could have used that to find where the bullet was inside of, you could say McKinley's pregnant stomach. And but they didn't do it, you know, because the doctor was doing. He said, "I know everything." I believe he was a
The
guy.
doctor
He was a
didn't trust
gynecologist.
it, but they also had trouble moving it. So
Right.
I don't think it would have fit into the home so that
Yeah.
you could have used it. But yeah, there's a lot behind that.
Well, they could have taken him still by cart over to there and looked at it.
Yeah.
They first treated him on the ground, so I don't know
Yeah.
why they didn't take him there. But
In fact, I am so old that I had a brain abscess when I was in my late 20s. And I was at Millard Fillmore Hospital. When you have that, what do they have to do? They have to do a CAT scan to find out what's going on. They had to put me in an ambulance and take me to Children's Hospital because the only CAT scan machine in Western New York was in Children's Hospital. So I ended up living. At least I think I did. Oh, I wouldn't be here today if I didn't.
well, thank you again, Rick, for that wonderful presentation. Just a quick little PSA before I let everybody go. Just some upcoming events. Tomorrow night we have a acoustic guitar concert here. Stephen Kruppner, who's a well-known local guitarist, will be doing an hour-and-a-half concert on the singer and songwriter as a storyteller. So that's what all of his songs will be based around. We have another book signing Saturday, May 6th from 2 to 4 here. Rob Thompson. Anyone who's read the Linden Murder books, he is the author of that. He wrote a book on the Sullivan expedition that's called Behold and Blush. So he'll be signing books here and hopefully having a bunch of copies, a new book. And then the next guest speaker is a perfect transition from this one. It's Derek Pratt from the Erie Canal Museum in Syracuse. Will be doing it on Black Rock versus Buffalo. So get a little bit more in depth than what Rick gave us, but that's what's upcoming. And if you enjoyed our presentation tonight, the best way to support us, if you'd like to in the future, is to become a member of the museum, and you'll be notified about everything that goes on here, and that allows us to do all sorts of programming like what we did tonight. And if you are interested, I do have some flyers in the gift shop I'll be happy to hand out. So thank you, everyone. And oh, I forgot one more. He's going to hit me, but our next Java with Joe, which is our morning presentations with coffee and donuts, will be by our city historian Larry Barnes, who's sitting in the audience here. And he will be talking about his travels to the other 8 Batavias of the United States. And he will be sure to make sure that list is, because I'm going to forget one right now. My brain is tapped out for the night, but there are 8. So be sure to check that out. That is next Thursday at 9 a.m., but most of our evening events are at 7 o'clock, so same time. And you can find everything on the website, Facebook, or just give me a call. So.
Thanks, everybody. hope to see you again in the future, and if you're interested.